I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor of EMS, and your moderator for today. Our focus today is on an important but largely unreported redistricting case out of Louisiana that the U.S. Supreme Court will hear on March 24th. How the court rules could have a critical impact on voting rights, especially in the South, but also in the nation. The Louisiana case comes on the heels of the landmark Allen versus Milligan decision in Alabama, in which the Supreme Court upheld Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, affirming the need for fair representation of Black voters. The Louisiana case presents the next major test in this ongoing battle, as state legislatures consider a growing number of bills that would weaken voter protections. The outcome of the Louisiana case could have a national ramification for voting rights and representation across the country. We are grateful to the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice and to Alabama Values for flagging this case for us and helping to organize this important discussion. EMS worked closely with both organizations to track the struggle over fair representation in redistricting during the years 2020 until 2023. Our guests today are Victoria Wenger, Counsel at NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who specializes in voting rights; Alanah Odoms, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Louisiana, ACLU-LA; Ashley Shelton, Executive Director of the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice; and Davante, Public Service Commissioner of Louisiana District 3. We are honored to have you all here today. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat and we will take them as time permits. So we begin with Victoria Wenger, Counsel with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who will provide a legal analysis of the Louisiana redistricting case and will explain why the outcome of the case could set a precedent for voting rights litigation nationwide. Please go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with so many familiar faces, clients, and friends. The road to get to the Supreme Court this year in Louisiana versus Calais has been long and winding and has involved several separate lawsuits over a variety of different years in multiple different courts. So bear with me while I try to provide some of that background so we can understand both how we got here and what it means moving forward. So after the 2020 census revealed that the Black population in Louisiana had grown while the white population had decreased, the Louisiana legislature still went about drawing a map that denied Black voters fair representation for their congressional delegation. This was despite the fact that organizers like Ashley and the Power Coalition and community members and lawyers like Alanah and others across the state had testified throughout the entire redistricting process about the vulnerability the state would be in for violating the Voting Rights Act if the legislature did not pass a map that truly represented the interests of Black voters, especially in a state where there is such a long legacy of racial discrimination, where there are still disparities, and where the Voting Rights Act truly applies to try to distribute power and ensure that there is equal opportunity for voters across all racial groups, the largest minority group in Louisiana being Black voters specifically. So Louisiana's population is roughly 1/3 Black. They have 6 congressional districts. And while the Voting Rights Act does not promise proportionality, it does protect fairness and it does try to counterbalance discrimination. So in 2022, after the legislature passed a map with only 1 out of 6 districts that represented a majority of Black voters and truly provided those voters with an opportunity to elect candidates that they believe will actually represent their interests, we filed a lawsuit. So LDF, along with the ACLU of Louisiana, which Alanah represents, and the National ACU and other attorneys, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of Commissioner Lewis, on behalf of Ashley and the Power Coalition, the state NAACP, a list of 9 individual Black voters who put their name behind this cause, saying that the state violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And in 2022, we were able to go to the Middle District of Louisiana in front of the Chief Judge, Shelley Dick, and prove in a preliminary injunction hearing, so essentially a mini trial before we could get to the full merits, we were able to prove that the VRA was likely violated here, specifically Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The court enjoined the map, said, hey, legislature, draw a new one. Legislature did not take that opportunity up. They didn't pass a new fair map. And we were ready to go about drawing a new one for that 2022 election. Now, this is where that Alabama case, Milligan, comes into play because in 2022, the Supreme Court had that case on appeal, but had not yet heard it. So what they
Victoria, can you slow down a bit for the
Sure.
interpreters, please? Thank you.
All right, it's a long backstory, so I'm trying to get
I
through
know.
it speedily.
I hear.
Okay, in 2022, while the determination in Milligan was still pending, the Supreme Court put our case on pause. That the effect of that was in 2022, a map with only one majority Black district was in place for those congressional elections. Now, fast forward, we know what happened in Milligan. The Supreme Court resoundingly held that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still the law of the land. They upheld decades of precedent that defends the rights of minority voters, like Black voters that we represent. And our case in 2023 was able to get back to the races. We then were able to go to the Fifth Circuit to defend that ruling that Judge Dick had made to essentially affirm the fact that, yes, there was a violation of the Voting Rights Act here and that Louisiana really needed to draw a new map. The Fifth Circuit gave the legislature a window to draw a new map. The district court provided for that window to go until the end of January 2024. So just as a new governor was inaugurated, a new Republican supermajority took over the state legislature, their first order of business was to go and draw a new map. This time, though, unlike their past efforts, they finally decided to draw a map with two majority Black districts. Now, there are a variety of different caveats that kind of set the foundation for where we are in the case here. Instead of drawing the map that the Robinson litigants, the Black voters that LDF and ACLU represented, had offered, which essentially created a new district that connected the capital of Baton Rouge with parishes to the north along the Mississippi River, the legislature instead decided to draw a map that went along the Red River up to the northwest, Shreveport, Alexandria, different cities. Now, the reason for that was very, very, very political. The legislature, and particularly the governor, had one incumbent Republican who they were most primed to try to displaced from his seat, we'll say. Garrett Graves, as a rival of the governor, was disfavored among the delegation. And so instead of drawing a map like we had represented or that the courts had already vetted in these other cases, they said, no, no, that will jeopardize Representative Julia Letlow's district. Instead, we're going to draw this a different way, still creating a second majority Black district, but also playing some political games at the same time. So we get the district, we celebrate that as a win because it does remedy the violation. It provides opportunity for Black voters that has been so long denied. But fast forward a group of, and this is where we get into the Calais litigation, a group of self-identified non-African American voters then file a lawsuit against this new map with the two majority Black districts, saying this is a racial gerrymander in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, the Equal Protection Clause essentially says that you can't have maps that racially gerrymander. That doctrine establishes that race cannot be the predominant factor. You can't have a map that is prioritizing placing people based off of their race and foregoing other principles or criteria, whether that's the shape of the district, the logic of it, communities it represents, or politics. So the plaintiffs here, now a group of non-Black voters, are trying to say that this map was just motivated by race and forget the fact that that motivation was undergirded by a variety of different lawsuits saying you have to consider race to now comply with the Voting Rights Act. So they're trying to put in tension the Equal Protection Clause and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The court, however, the Supreme Court, in decades of doctrine, has said that there are ways to balance these considerations quite easily. Number one, it is not a racial gerrymander if race is not the predominant factor. And we certainly argue that while race was a factor, it was no more predominant than politics or these other considerations like honoring the Red River or I-49, the decisions that the legislature had the sovereignty to weigh and preference in the map drawing process. So number one, we're saying this isn't a racial gerrymander because race did not predominate. However, the Supreme Court has still created another exception where even if they find, or a lower court finds, that race was predominant, state legislatures can still prioritize race in that way if they have good reason to believe they have to comply with the Voting Rights Act. And so our real question for the court here is what is better reason than complying with multiple federal court determinations? The Supreme Court has allowed maps that were less than pretty, were maybe a little political, and certainly considered race to go into effect on far less than years of federal court litigation and very decisive determinations. So this is all to say we are going to the Supreme Court now representing Black voters as intervening defendants on the same side of the case now as the state we were once suing in a separate lawsuit to defend a map that finally provides for fairness, but also admittedly and so clearly in the record is balancing other considerations, including politics and including these kind of sovereign map-making decisions that legislatures are entitled to make. So the outcome is about fairness. It's about representation for people like Commissioner Lewis, for all of the Black folks that Ashley and Power Coalition have organized for years now. But it's also about principles of legislative sovereignty, about how we balance constitutional and statutory precedent, how we go about drawing maps for decades and decades and decades to come. So I could elaborate more, but I'm sure I've both confused and bored you all. So I will turn it over to either questions or the other panelists.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much for that explanation. We have some questions in the chat. Henrietta, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Pilar. Victoria, you said that the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Voting Rights Act, but didn't it make a ruling that watered it down, saying that part of it wasn't necessary?
So there have been a variety of different cases in recent years that have engaged around the Voting Rights Act. And this is because the way that we assess voting rights kind of falls into different buckets. So there was a case, Brnovich, which was addressing issues of vote denial, things like voter ID laws or moving polling sites or other practices that election administrators or lawmakers might make that completely deny voters their opportunity. And in that case, Brnovich in recent years, the Supreme Court really made the level of proof and the tests that plaintiffs have to fulfill to prove a violation much harder. Separately, however, in Milligan, they were addressing what we call vote dilution, which really comes about in the map drawing process. And the idea here is that a voter isn't completely denied the opportunity to vote, but the weight of their vote is watered down. That, they might be able to go to a voting booth, but do they have confidence that they'll be able to elect their candidate of choice? And so this idea of vote dilution is seen through what we call packing and cracking, where you might pack a minority population into one district. So they're like 60% or 70% of that population, when if you had dispersed that population, they'd have more influence in more district elections. Or you have the alternative, which is cracking, where you never have that population reaching a threshold where they can decisively determine the outcome of an election. So you saw that in play in Louisiana before when you had a map that was really packing all the Black voters into one district between New Orleans and Baton Rouge and then spreading them out across these other districts. So here in Milligan, they upheld Section 2 and the Voting Rights Act as it applies to redistricting on pretty much all of the precedent and rules that we've been operating under for many decades. In Alexander, which was a separate case from South Carolina, they addressed constitutional doctrine under the Equal Protection Clause. And that was a different case where just last year, they essentially made it harder to prove racial gerrymandering claims, which again was to the disadvantage of Black voters in South Carolina there. But oddly here should really actually weigh into a favorable determination for both the state and our intervening clients here, Black voters, because it is, essentially making it harder for these non-African American voters to prove gerrymandering in Louisiana. So all to
Thank
say,
you.
voting rights has been at the court a long time, and there's different doctrines in play here.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you so much. Let's move on the interest of time, even though we have more questions, but we'll have time for those questions a little bit later. Thank you so much, Victoria, for the insightful legal breakdown. Now let's turn to Alanah Odoms, the first Black woman to lead the ACLU of Louisiana, who will explain why this is not a new fight, but a continuation of a long history of voting discrimination. Mrs. Odoms, a civil rights leader, mother, and spiritual support to activists across the state, is challenging systemic racial and gender injustice. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Pilar, and thank you so much for having us this afternoon. So just a few days ago, I was in Selma, Alabama. I had the distinct honor of walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge for the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. I marched with my brothers and sisters from the ACLU, 13 southern states, carrying signs and banners demanding voting rights. Thousands more gathered with us from around the nation, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, each of us feeling the weight of history beneath our feet. It was impossible not to feel the energy of those who came before us, the foot soldiers, the civil rights activists, the ordinary people who put their bodies on the line for something bigger than themselves. They marched in 1965 knowing that they might have been beaten, and in fact they were, knowing that they might have been jailed, and they were, but believing with everything in them that voting rights were worth the risk. And now, 60 years later, here we are, still marching, still fighting, still litigating. Because while some things have changed, the struggle for voting rights is far from over. Louisiana's history with voting is a painful reflection of this truth. It is a history shaped by exclusion, by discrimination, by an intentional effort to keep Black people from fully participating in our democracy. If I could put it very simply, voter suppression in Louisiana is like putting a boot on the neck of Black voters. Voting rights activists and attorneys like the ones that you see featured on our panel today are simply asking for that boot to be removed, not temporarily, but permanently, in accordance with the Constitution and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Conservatives like the ones in the case before the Supreme Court seem to think that having to take the boots off the necks of Black voters is somehow reverse discrimination. Moreover, they think that there was never a problem with the boot being there at all until Black voters started complaining about it. And if we would just go away, so would the problem. However, what we know is that when we fight, we win. And there was a moment, a brief time in our history after the Civil War when democracy in Louisiana looked different. During Reconstruction, 6 African Americans were elected to Congress from Louisiana, a testament to the power that Black voters wielded when they were finally given access to the ballot. But history teaches us that when progress is made, there is often a backlash. As soon as Black voters began to exercise real influence, white lawmakers moved swiftly to strip them of that power. The end of Reconstruction ushered in an era of violent voter suppression, Jim Crow laws, and constitutional trickery that wiped nearly every Black voter from the rolls. Louisiana's very notorious Constitution of 1898 introduced literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all designed to keep Black people from voting. And they worked. Black voter registration was virtually wiped out in just a few years. Now, Black people make up over 30%, nearly 33% of Louisiana's population. And we know that a federal court ruled that Louisiana's maps were a violation of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, and that Black voters deserve another district where they can elect a representative of their choice. And we have, in fact, done that. And we've seen that the efforts that folks have done in order to reverse this very hard-fought victory are still quite powerful. And we have to understand that voting is about more than just ballots and elections. It's about dignity. It is about power. It is about whether we are seen, whether our voices matter, whether this country truly belongs to all of us or just to a selected few. And that is why we cannot afford to sit back and wait for the courts to do the right thing. Justice is not automatic. It is something that we must fight for generation after generation. It is something that we must demand. The people who marched on that bridge in Selma 60 years ago did not wait for permission to be free. They did not wait for the courts or politicians to decide that it was the time to recognize their humanity. They walked, they marched, they bled, they litigated, and because of them, the Voting Rights Act became law. But we know that the law alone is not enough. We have seen voting rights gutted. We have seen maps manipulated. We have seen democracy shrink before our eyes. And so we have to keep marching. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep litigating. Robinson versus Calais will be a significant decision. But whatever happens in that courtroom, we cannot forget what history has taught us, that justice only comes when we make it come, that power concedes nothing without a demand, that we cannot simply hope for a better future. We have to build it with our own hands. 60 years ago, they marched in Selma for the vote. Today, we march for the right to be counted, to be represented, to be heard. And if we stay the course, if we keep pushing, if we keep litigating, if we keep marching, we refuse to accept anything less than full and equal participation in this democracy, then no court, no legislature, no system of power will be able to deny us what we are owed. That is our charge, our collective charge. It is our duty, and I believe we are ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that inspiring presentation. There are some questions in the chat, and there's a question from Araceli Martinez. She's from La Opinión in Los Angeles, Spanish language newspaper. She's wondering what the impact of this is outside of Louisiana. What is the impact for the rest of us, the rest of the United States? What's at stake for us?
Yeah, so the Voting Rights Act is an act that pertains to every state in the nation. And so it is imperative that what the court decides today, whether the Voting Rights Act and particularly Section 2 still has power, determines how elections will be handled and, in fact, how districts will be drawn all across the nation. What we saw is that I believe one of the prior questions actually spoke to whether the Voting Rights Act still has its full power and authority. Well, back in 2013, there was a case that actually weakened the power of section of the Voting Rights Act, in particular, Section 5, which is the preclearance section. And so states that have a history of discrimination no longer have to go to the Department of Justice to change their rules and regulations around voting. And what we saw immediately after that 2013 case was cases all around the nation where states were enacting incredibly discriminatory changes to their voting rules, but we didn't have those protections. The state had to litigate those cases as opposed to the federal government having to clear those changes on the front end. And so what I would imagine is that this could create a cascade effect where once again, states around the nation would start being quite nefarious in the way that they are doing their redistricting processes and completely ignoring the census, completely ignoring population changes, suggesting that the country is becoming blacker and browner, and continuing to try to maintain districts that largely elect candidates of choice for white voters.
Can you tell us what kind of organizing is going on in Louisiana around this case? What do you fear will happen if the court rules against?
Oh, there's lots of organizing going on. And I think the most exciting thing, and I'm quite sure my panelist, Ashley Shelton, will speak about this in greater depth, but we don't think about organizing for voting rights just in terms of one single election or one single case. We have been working to increase turnout for our elections, and we've started to do that obviously with our gubernatorial election, which was one of our major challenges. We are looking at special elections that take place in the state, very similar to the one that we have coming up on March 29th, where there are many constitutional amendments. So there are lots of organizing efforts to turn people out for those, because we can't simply wait until we have a seminal statewide election to bring people out. We have to start organizing people for smaller elections, special elections, and preparing them. We are also continuing to fight. We still feel very confident that the court will continue to uphold Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The federal court's record is very strong. We won at the federal court level, and we believe, honestly, that if the court has already just affirmed Section 2, it would be quite shocking and an overturning of decades-long precedent for them to go back in the opposite direction. So we still feel very confident about the court's ruling.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on to our third speaker, Ashley Shelton with the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice. Mrs. Shelton will discuss the implications for Black and minority communities in the state where her organization has significantly increased voter participation among communities of color and influenced political changes at both municipal and state levels. The Power Coalition for Equity and Justice is a plaintiff in the Louisiana case. Ms. Shelton, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Pilar, and I want to thank you guys for having me this afternoon. So yes, the Power Coalition has been dedicated to engagement and really working with citizens across the state of Louisiana that have been historically disenfranchised to actually walk in their agency and their power as voters, and to ensure that they understood the power of both their vote and their voice. And to Alanah's point, we have been working on this since the census, right? And so we mobilized, we were out in community, even in the midst of COVID, which made it even more difficult to do census work. But we were really clear from the beginning that we knew the population numbers had shifted for Black and other communities of color. And we also, wanted to make sure that we got as fair a count as possible. And from there, then we began the work of, educating people about what redistricting is. And over the course of this fight, which has been many years, and Victoria Wenger spoke to, kind of the history of this case. And what's really interesting, and I'll drop it in the chat before when I finish speaking about like the process of getting to this final day, or the opening arguments, March 24th. I mean, it looks like a Chutes and Ladders map in terms of like we've gone here, we've gone there, we've been in the Fifth Circuit, we've been to the Supreme Court before, right? Like this is a case that has certainly lived many lives. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, however, is that all throughout this journey with, trying to get to fair and equitable maps, the people of Louisiana have been clear and consistent in, their, appreciation that without media training, without a bunch of training on exactly what redistricting was, the citizens of Louisiana were really clear from the very beginning that they wanted fair maps and they wanted the ability to elect candidates of choice. And that just shined through this entire process. And I think it has been, one of the really powerful levers that we've used throughout this case to kind of keep pushing forward is that, yes, we're organizing and supporting community and having their voices heard. And then community has been showing up. And so from the state doing listening sessions across the state where we had unprecedented, participation, to the legislative hearings, also unprecedented participation in a redistricting session at each point that we had a redistricting session. We even had folks come out in the ice and the snow last year. And so it's one of those things where like, that's how important this is. We don't even get ice and snow. The interstate shut down. But what I'm really proud of though, is that community still felt like this was so critical and they wanted to ensure that their voices were heard throughout this process, everyone from college students to, to our elders. And I think some of the more profound statements in that first redistricting session, we heard from a young woman who was the SGA president at Dillard University. And her testimony was so powerful. And she reflected back to this legislature that because they don't do the right thing, this is why our young people leave our state. That's why our young people are leaving in droves, because they cannot trust them to do the right thing. And I think that like those comments, both coming from folks across, age and race and ethnicity, were just so many different powerful moments in this process. So as we prepare for the opening arguments for Robinson versus Calais, we have been doing a lot of work to prepare, both to educate and prepare communities about what's getting ready to happen. A lot of people were unaware. We did, in fact, elect a candidate of choice. Well, the citizens of District 6 did, in fact, elect a candidate of choice. He actually was elected this fall, and so people thought it was over. over, right? So, like this one more iteration, has been an epiphany for some folks. And so we've been making sure to get the word out, to educate people. We're bringing about 60 to 75 folks with us to DC from the state of Louisiana to be there. We're excited to have a rally and to be working with both students, like I said, across age and race to engage in a conversation about why this is so important and why we continue to fight for fair and equitable maps. And I think what we are also aware of is that this fight isn't just March 24th, right? Like that we have to both educate and engage right now. We have to educate and engage on the 24th. And then throughout the time that we are, working to, waiting to see what the ultimate ruling is of the Supreme Court. And much like Alanah, I am optimistic. I am very positive about the fact that I think, if you look at the record, right, that has been built around redistricting in Louisiana, it is powerful. It is, there's a depth of stories and a depth of experiences. And then one of the things that we said throughout this fight was that we knew that if Black voters thought that they could elect a candidate of choice, that it would impact voter turnout for Black voters. And, there were many arguments throughout this fight where the lawyers said that wasn't true, that, that we're post-racial, all of these things that we absolutely know not to be true. But also, if we were post-racial, then why can't we just do fair, right? Like let's make it fair. But what we did see on the other side of the election in the fall was that both for the seat in Louisiana and in Alabama, we saw a 2-point increase in voter turnout among Black voters, and then almost a 5-point increase in Alabama. And so it is proof that we don't have like that. Yes, there's some issues that the Black community feels about politics, democracy, et cetera, but that when given the choice to actually have more representation and they had the power to do it, they did so, right? And the Brennan Center just released this report on, the impact of, the true ability to elect candidates of choice when you have Black and other communities of color feeling like they can actually engage and indeed elect a candidate that they feel will vote and represent their interest at Congress. And so really proud of that work, really proud to continue to stand with with the people of Louisiana, continuing to engage, continuing to give them the opportunity to have their voices heard in this process. And again, I'm really optimistic that we'll come out victorious.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley. My colleague at EMS, Sunita Sorachi, has a question. It's an interesting question. Sunita, go ahead.
Oh, Sunita, we can't hear you.
Sunita?
Hi, good morning. I wanted to ask, Louisiana has a stretch of about 85 miles along the Mississippi River, which is known as Cancer Alley, one of the most polluted regions in the world. There are 200 petrochemical factories there. And I was wondering who represents that area, and has the map been gerrymandered to lessen a sort of a Black voter bloc that could fight against additional chemical factories being placed in that area?
So, the new map, the river parishes have always been, I want to say in Congressional District 2, that is a minority majority district. And so I think what has been unfortunate, right, is that when you have a packed district like it was, so it was Baton Rouge, river parishes, New Orleans, somebody always, like the larger metros, kind of hold the power. And in the case of that district in particular, was very New Orleans centric. And what we see now with the district unpacked is that, the river parishes are squarely within District 2, along with New Orleans. And so it is my hope that we will see more engagement and more opportunity and representation because there's less places for the congressmen of that district to be distracted by trying to, manage the needs of the major metros. And so now it's just specifically, well, not specifically, but largely New Orleans and then the river parishes. And so I think that and I think too that like the river parishes also have a very powerful turnout. Like, I mean, I think that, what we have seen in their numbers is that, the river parishes turn out and the Black women in those districts in particular. And so we're hoping that they have more voice now that the map is more equitable. But at the same time that that's happening, we're watching, our own Supreme Court here in the state of Louisiana deny EPA the right to air monitor, and then we see all of the things happening at the federal level. So there's even more urgency around, like how we continue to fight for equity and justice in the state.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. More questions from the chat. Let me see. Well, Henrietta asks, given the conservative makeup of the Supreme Court and Trump's influence, how optimistic are you that the court's decision will not be politicized? And any of the speakers can answer this.
Tori, do you want to take a stab?
Sure. So, I mean, we have seen, as I mentioned before, a variety of different rulings on voting rights matters in just the last 2 or 3 years, let alone going back to the Shelby decision that Alanah highlighted. I would say that, this case is very unique. We are on the same side of the matter as the state of Louisiana, who, when we were just, litigating the Section 2 question, we were on the opposite side of the case. So there's a variety of different principles, legal principles, policy principles, ethical considerations that all come into play and could speak to various justices in different ways. We're talking about the balance of powers, about state sovereignty, about honoring federal court precedent and rulings, not creating tensions between dueling federal court rulings. And while at the end of the day, the Legal Defense Fund and ACLU and Power Coalition are there to represent the voices and the interests of Black voters and Black people in Louisiana, let alone nationwide, we're on the same side of the case as the state of Louisiana, where they're trying to defend their state legislature's sovereignty to map draw and comply with federal law on their own terms. So again, it's very hard to predict where any of the justices will come down on this specific case because it is so nuanced and it's really looking at the interplay of all of these different rulings that they've been making in different years in recent history that have, come out sometimes in ways that have reaffirmed protections for Black voters and communities of color, and in other times have weakened the protections of the Voting Rights Act or the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much. And we'll just go ahead with the fourth speaker and then take the questions that are left in the chat and any other questions that come up. So our next speaker is Davante Lewis, a social justice advocate and policy expert who made history in 2022 by becoming the first openly LGBTQ plus person elected to a state-level position in Louisiana. He represents District 3 of the Louisiana Public Service Commission, overseeing utility regulation for a region that encompasses parts of Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and surrounding parishes. Mr. Davis will discuss the broader political and national implications of the Louisiana case on national voting rights laws and strategies to combat voter suppression at the policy level. Mr. Lewis, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and it's a great honor to be here with all of you. As this case, as my dear friends have already explained in Louisiana, there were significant political ramifications about this, right? For years, Louisianians have asked for a second congressional district, utilizing the simple math that we like to say, 1/3, which is the Black population of the state of Louisiana, the second Blackest state in the nation, should be represented in our congressional delegation. Currently, there are 6 members of Congress after the last apportionment. So 1/3 of 6 equals 2. And that was the argument that so many of us made over the course of this case, over the course of the political dynamics. It is interesting, as you heard, that what we saw was that the courts really signaled political change in our state. Without the original rulings of the Fifth Circuit identifying that they believed that the map could be unconstitutional, we saw a political dynamic that we had never seen before, where a vast majority of a supermajority Republican legislature voted to redistrict Louisiana's congressional map and include 2 minority-majority districts. We have seen this very similar in the state of Alabama as well, which gives, I think, context for friends and all in South Carolina who've been talking about a different congressional district in other states as well, the political courage to see what has happened in some of the deep southern states that matter. When we think about kind of our rights to voting, we are realizing that democracy is at threat. And we cannot talk about policy change if we do not talk about how districts are made and how people vote in those districts. Because if you can control the game, you can control the outcome. And that's what we have seen right now, is that there is an effort to ensure that the game is rigged. And this lawsuit and my participation was about ensuring that we stood up for every Louisianian and allowed them the opportunity to make their voice be heard. We have talked significantly about voter suppression and voter apathy, but like I like to remind people, if we know our vote does not matter because the district is so gerrymandered, why should I participate in the political system? And when not participating in the political system because of a congressional race has deep ramifications down ballot to state legislative districts, to mayors, and to judges. One of the things that happens here in Louisiana is just about every judge we have is an elected position. So ensuring that we are broadening the base, including individuals to make voter participation more likely, also produces a different judicial strategy here in Louisiana, because we know the judiciary is so deeply tied to our electoral process in the state of Louisiana. So we saw significant engagement among people. You heard from Ashley talking about at the session, while we saw people on a snowy day, icy day at the Capitol showing up when most people expected no one to be present. We saw significant political pressure among members of the Black Caucus, actually, who were wavering whether or not they should vote for a new district to bring them back into the coalition to ensure. And what we saw is significant engagement of everyday citizens watching this process and understanding what is exactly at stake. And as we saw in the election cycle of 2024, that work came to fruition, where we saw Black voters turn out at a higher level than they had previously, showcasing that the work around redistricting, the work of voter participation and allowing voters the opportunity to ensure that their voice may be heard significantly changed the outlook of what could have happened and what is going to happen. So I see that our future requires more engagement. It requires us to call the question. And it requires that we must take the risk. If you would have told all 4 of us on this call in January 2021, when we started this process, that we would have 2 minority-majority districts, I think all 4 of us would have said probably not. But because we kept in saying we're going to try, even though the odds are against us, we're going to mobilize voters, we are going to push political pressure on policy, we are going to litigate as well, we saw the work coming to fruition. And so I think the political strategy here is that we have to have all hands on deck. There's not one strategy that it works, it is all of the above. So we advocated, we agitated, we litigated, and now we have results and success. And I believe that's the path forward for everybody across this nation, no matter which district they may be in, living in a gerrymandered city council place, living in a gerrymandered judicial, or even at the highest level of our congressional map, that continuing to push forward and doing the work will produce the results, because we know justice will always be on our side.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis. And because a lot of the reporters in this call are from all over, they are from all over the United States. There's some questions here in regards to how this affects other communities. And Nicole Shang, I was going to call on her because she asked a couple of interesting questions, maybe for you, maybe for one of the other panelists. Nicole, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to ask. Well, I had posted 2 questions. Was a restriction of redistricting of Los Angeles Koreatown There was before 2020, there was a four city district was in Koreatown. So I was wondering if this is an example of gerrymandering similar to the Louisiana case, where a significant minority group's voting power was diluted. And another question I was posted was, in the city of Los Angeles, a significant number of Asian voters live, but there's no district that properly, represents the Asian community. So I'd like to hear what is your advice from the panel, or what steps should the Asian community take to ensure a fair redistricting process? Koreatown is still struggling because it has divided into two districts. So, and then there are like a significant, more than 30% of Asian voters are living in Koreatown, but still we can make one proper representative.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Nicole.
absolutely. I mean, I think this is where that organizing and mobilization work goes, right? Utilizing the data that is at hand to articulate why a community is being underrepresented and deserves representation. As I mentioned in the Louisiana case, we started with, as I said, the simple census demographics, that Black voters in Louisiana made up 33% of the state's population, and we have 6 districts. And so 33% of 6 is 2. And I think starting there is a great place. It's not a perfect place. I will tell you, there are some challenges, especially if your community is not homogenous, right? If the density of the communities also matter, that is a challenge that we do face here in Louisiana sometimes, is that the Black population of Louisiana is spread out. I know a lot of people assume that the Black population is Baton Rouge and New Orleans, but there's significantly along the Mississippi-Louisiana border. A chunk of Black voters live in central Louisiana and in southwest Louisiana. So that does sometimes make it a little bit more challenging. But because Koreatown, as you were describing, seems to be more homogenous, I think you have a stronger argument of activity to make the case why we should be represented, why our voices matter, and why we should be a part of this process. And I think it's starting with what benefits come from the communities. Why do you need that representation? And talking about what it makes you all of interest. I mean, I think that's a challenge that we will constantly hear in redistricting, is about what makes up a community of interest. And the other side argues that race should not be it, but there are systematic things that are just diabolically different in communities that can be highlighted and used in ways that I think would benefit your fight in redistricting.
I see.
Are there, and there was also some comment about this. Are there other states where this Louisiana case would immediately have an impact? That there are burning questions on redistricting and unfairness.
Well, I mean, I think there are challenges. If the court rules against the Louisiana case, it could open the door for other districts across the country that are currently in existence in the 2030 redistricting cycle to go away. So there is some downside factions that, I mean, I think are key, especially when we get into some of the challenges that we may see from reapportionment of the congressional map. I mean, you're looking at states like New York, Tennessee, for example. So but then there's also opportunities. If the Louisiana case upholds, then there are ways that we can see other states who are still talking about what that looks like, enshrining Alabama, looking at South Carolina, potentially Mississippi, depending upon their population growth. And so I think there are ramifications on both sides that have to be at the forefront, and we will see the ramifications of this depending on how the court rules.
In Louisiana itself, there's also growth in other communities like Latinos and the API. How will they be affected by this?
I think they will be mostly affected, honestly, not on this case, but on our state legislative redistricting case, where we are seeing populations grow, especially outside of the New Orleans metro, with a heavy concentration of Latino population growth, as well as the Vietnamese community. We just recently got some data today that showed there's a pretty much outward migration of the state of Louisiana. However, inward migration from these two communities is what's keeping the population center around New Orleans relatively stabilized. And so I think as that grows, that will change. It will keep the minority district, especially since a good chunk of those communities are within the second CD congressional district as it is now. But I think there will be more ramifications on the local government as well as the state legislative maps.
Thank you so much. Any other comments from the panelists about any of these questions?
I just wanted to pick up on one point that Commissioner Lewis left off on, is that in terms of the impact nationwide, but also more locally in Louisiana or any of the states and areas that folks are calling in from nationwide, is that these are federal laws. We're talking about the United States Constitution, how the Equal Protection Clause is interpreted. We're talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And while this case is about congressional delegations, very, very large districts representing hundreds of thousands of people, the weight of the law and how the Supreme Court interprets it goes down to every single districted map in the country. So that could mean your city council, your school board, a public service commission like the one that the Commissioner Lewis serves on. So any layer of government where after the 2030 census, we're going to be drawing new maps, that will all be guided by the precedent established here. And if we're able to have the Supreme Court once again stand on the side of fairness and make sure the full protections of the Voting Rights Act cannot be corrupted by some type of gamesmanship trying to pit the Equal Protection Clause of anything against the rights of minority voters, that has true ramifications in the immediate future for pending cases, for maps that might be in limbo right now. But if we're thinking to, the upcoming census and the fact that nationwide, all of Congress will be redistricted again, but so many local communities will be looking at those smaller subpopulations where maybe there isn't an Asian population or a Latino population in Louisiana that could compromise a majority congressional district. Certainly, we might see local parish governments or school boards or other places where there's new opportunity for local representation and opportunities to elect candidates of choice. So truly, the implications of this are nationwide. They are very federal in Congress, but they're also super, super local.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that. It puts it in context. And we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to call on someone who is on the call as well to make some comments. The executive director of Alabama Values, an organization that we have worked with on this issue, Anisha Hardy. Could you tell us what message you'd most like our media to take away from this briefing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the most important thing, what we've discussed here today, that it isn't just about redistricting, that it is about people power, because having the right to vote is not enough if that vote does not translate to real power. And one thing that we've learned, the census data has shown us that our country is becoming more diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, culture, political ideology. And yet what we are witnessing right now is an all-out attempt to concentrate power in the hands of a few at the expense and subjugation of Black voters in Louisiana and in other states, other underserved and other underrepresented community members. And so I wanted to leave here today just understanding that this is not just a technical issue. And that when we talk about having fair representation, representation is more than just about who's holding the seat, because representation means, being in community, understanding the struggles, the hopes, and the realities of the people that you serve so that you can pass policies to improve their quality of life. And so the community should have the power to choose who holds that power. And so, we can't afford to be silent, because we know that when the people go silent, the media goes silent. And when the media goes silent, it signals to the public that this issue is no longer urgent, no longer relevant. And that is how oppression sustains itself. So my charge to everyone, the media on the call today, is to just go and share what you've heard here. Use your platforms to bolster the community education, organizing, and mobilization that organizations like the Power Coalition are doing every day, and just continue to ask the hard questions. Continue to report on the fight because, in all honesty, this fight for fair maps and fair representation, this is a fight for what true and a fair democracy should look like. So that's what we're fighting for right now. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your words. And just for the last couple of minutes, I'll go around the panel and ask each of you what you would like to see ethnic media, us, do to raise awareness about this case. Let's start with Victoria and make it short, please.
Certainly. So a lot of the arguments we will hear at the Supreme Court in framing will be about the rights of the state legislature, about the state of Louisiana, legislative sovereignty, etc. It's very likely that the case will be determined on wonky precedent and principles like that. But what's been so compelling to me and what I love about this panel is that the map that we have right now, the idea of fair representation in Louisiana, was born out of the efforts and labor and bravery of Black voters who, as Ashley said, literally showed up in an ice storm in the state of Louisiana to make their voices heard on MLK Day last year when this whole session convened and the governor called lawmakers to the state capitol who've been fighting for years and decades. We have the coolest clients ever. So if you're able to profile them, speak their names, and bring them into this conversation, I just think there's so much poignancy and power to understanding that there are names and faces and communities behind this effort and this history that we're making right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Alanah, Odoms?
Hi, I feel that especially among diverse communities, sometimes it can feel as if a focus on one particular community means the exclusion of others. And I think it is really important to recognize that we actually have an incredibly, persuasive and powerful shared mission of protecting voting rights for the most vulnerable groups actually means greater protection for all communities of color. And so I would just really kind of drive that mission home, really drive that idea home that we're not simply just talking about Black voters. We are actually talking about making sure that all historically marginalized communities who have had to fight for representation actually have a stake in this battle, and that when we are united and that we're actually supporting one another, we have greater opportunities for all communities to be protected.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And Ashley, Shelton?
Alanah, you said what I wanted to say.
Exactly.
But I would add to that too. I mean, I think that like in this moment in this country, it feels like there's so much othering. There's so much, who gets to belong or not. And I think that on this particular issue, this particular fight, I always talk about your ability to elect a candidate of choice is like, to me, very critical and core to my rights as a citizen and my ability to engage in democracy in this country. And I always say that this fight in particular really does come down to whether or not Black and other communities of color have to live in this country as second-class citizens, literally, right? Like we know we experience it in some policies and in some ways that our communities are policed and are governed. But I think at the end of the day, this is something a bit different where where you're forcing people to not have the ability to elect people that are going to actually represent them, which is why, this most recent election and this new seat in Louisiana was so critical, and why we will continue to fight for it, and why we all should continue to fight for it, because this isn't just about African American communities. This is about all of us being able to truly be represented in this democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis.
Yes, I think, it's hard to follow Ashley, Alanah, and Tor, but I will try. I think what we saw in this moment is, and what I think people should take away, is the spirit of resiliency, but also the spirit of work. This was not just done overnight. It took time. There are challenging moments. But I think what we wanted to demonstrate is that policy can change when you push it to do so. And in all of these moments, we have to build a stronger and better community, and then keep those coalitions building up, which is what exactly what we did. It wasn't just the original, we kept building, kept getting people engaged, kept getting people involved, and showcasing the power of us all together. And so when we think about what's important about this moment is that the work can come to fruition if you keep pushing through.
Thank you. We ran out of time. We encourage you to continue covering this case and its implications. And we will send all participants a media toolkit to prepare by Alabama Values and the Power Coalition that includes key facts and messaging points and story angles to assist in your reporting. Please feel free to reach out to our speakers for follow-up information and interviews. And goodbye to all. Have a good weekend.